Hey guys, John Kalibas, founder of AIM Academics here. This video is all about study techniques, raising awareness to some of the most common study techniques that we see students using year after year that causes them to fall short from their dream ATAR. In saying that, I'll be discussing some better ways to study that you may or may not have heard of before that are backed by some of the most recent scientific studies in the area. I founded AIM Academics after realizing there's this huge void or niche that needed to be filled where so many students, even the most clever students, don't actually know how to learn or how to study. It's quite ironic that all throughout our primary school years and high school years, there's not really much of an emphasis on how to efficiently study. Most students don't even realize that there's actually more efficient ways to study that could save you so many hours and actually get you better grades. Our team is obsessed with efficient study. Our aim is to transform the way students approach their studies so that they can actually spend less hours studying because they're so confident in that their approach is going to get them the grades that they want. In terms of my own academic achievements, I graduated with a 99 ATAR and I was also awarded the Way College Prize and Medal for being the highest scoring Stage 2 chemistry student in South Australia. Since then, I've gone on to complete a Bachelor of Science where I've been awarded several academic scholarships, including a HDR scholarship for my current master's program. So I've got some slides prepared for us to have a look at. So in this video, we'll be covering cognitively superficial study habits that continuously let you down. We'll also be comparing effortful and superficial or passive study habits. We'll be debunking the idea that practice questions is everything. Practice questions is amongst the most common study techniques. But if everyone is doing them, what's really separating the high achievers, the 99 ATAR achievers, from the students who don't achieve a 99 ATAR but still did the same set of practice questions that someone else did? I'll also be highlighting that ways that we can study more efficiently in less time so that we can, not feel guilty for taking a break and actually have a social life. These are the exact same study techniques that I personally used to make my way through my bachelor's degree, which helped me score academic scholarships and top marks. Simply at AIM Academics, we help students achieve top ATARs and impressive marks. You can see it for yourself. So many students that we see graduating year after year, scoring 99 ATARs, and this is because we help them unlock different, more effective ways to study that they never actually previously considered. We honestly just want to be providing you with the most safest, effective path towards a 99 ATAR where you can avoid the mistakes and misconceptions that we see students make year after year that causes them to fall short from their goal ATAR. The first concept that I want to touch on in this video is this concept of desirable difficulties. It sounds quite weird that difficulties could be desirable. So we have this notion where students feel like they're actually learning more from cognitively superficial passive tasks opposed to those effortful active tasks. However, in contrast to students' judgments, it's actually those effortful active tasks that are so much more efficient for learning. So studying shouldn't actually be an easy passive experience. It should take effort and it should feel a bit uncomfortable. And this is a good thing. This indicates that you're probably learning more than if, studying was just a walk in the park. So an example of this is that students might feel like they might be learning more from, say, rereading their notes or rewriting their notes or even highlighting their notes, opposed to being tested on the exact same material. This might be because as human beings, we tend to gravitate towards things that are comfortable for us. So for example, when we reread our notes or rewrite our notes, it feels comfortable and it feels nice and it doesn't give us, any uncomfortable feelings or bruises to our egos. However, when we get tested on material, it doesn't quite make us feel as satisfied or as good because we're forced to quickly identify where the gaps in our knowledge are when we get things wrong or, are confused with concepts. Often students are actually really bad at gauging whether they actually understand a concept just from reading it. So when we're reading something, it's not actually a reliable measure of whether we could reproduce it or, apply it in a test or an exam. So you might ask, well, the best approach might just be to continuously test myself then, do hundreds or thousands of practice questions, and that would be the true way to master an idea or concept. Well, that's not quite right. Practice questions are good. I used practice questions when I was completing my bachelor's degree. I also used a lot of practice questions in year 12, but there is actually a problem with practice questions that we'll come to a little bit later in this video. So during learning, the ultimate goal is to generate knowledge that's robustly integrated within related knowledge so that it's easily accessible and you can recall it and apply it when you need. And several studies have actually shown that it's the desirable difficulties that create this deep-rooted learning. Let's say you were preparing to climb a mountain. You wouldn't go for long, peaceful, enjoyable walks around your local park, although they feel nice, because mountain climbing is inherently difficult. The same applies for sitting a test or an exam. You shouldn't just sit there and highlight or rewrite your notes because that experience is so far different from the experience of sitting a test or an exam. However, obviously, if you're not experienced in climbing a mountain, it would be far too dangerous for an inexperienced mountain climber to go ahead and just go 100% trying to climb a mountain. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, you can't just go full speed ahead chasing every single task that's challenging, because every task serves its unique purpose and not every challenging task. However, obviously, if you're not experienced in climbing a mountain, one thing that I do want to quickly mention here, it would be far too dangerous for an inexperienced mountain climber to go ahead and just score 100% trying to climb a mountain, as well as those who didn't. And what we've seen is that both students who did score a 99 ATAR and those who didn't, a lot of the time they're actually using the same study techniques, such as practice questions. So it can't really be practice questions that's giving people 99 ATARs. You might think, well, the people that got 99 ATARs, they're just geniuses or something. You know, they're just academic freaks of nature. But what we need to think about here is the people that used practice questions and scored a 99 ATAR are the people that you hear about, and they're the ones that are advocating for practice questions. You don't hear from the thousands of people that used practice questions but didn't get a 99 ATAR. Majority of students are using practice questions, but very few students score 99 ATARs, only the top 1 percentile. This phenomenon actually has a name called survivorship bias, and it's basically the process of blindly believing that some correlation proves causation. For example, let's say 3 of 5 extremely high performing students all attended the same school. We might be tempted to believe that that high school might be very good, but it might just be that that school is larger or some other factor that we're not considering. So how is it that some students only do practice questions and still score 99 ATARs? The thing is about these students is these are the students that are compensating in some other way that we don't see. So it's not actually the practice questions that cause them to get the 99 ATAR. It might be, you know, their natural intelligence or some other variable. So this is just one of those things. We can't have everyone scoring 99 ATARs. It's mathematically impossible. So for those who do score a 99 ATAR, they need to be able to differentiate themselves from everyone else. This may be through, you know, natural intelligence, or it could be through adopting better study habits, which other people aren't using. If you simply just learn how to learn better, that could actually leverage you above other students that, you know, might be more intelligent or have this natural ability. A really famous example where an individual was able to use compensation to outperform someone who is just genetically talented is Andre de Grasse. Andre didn't win the genetic lottery for sprinting. He's only 5'8", however, he's one of the most famous Olympic sprinters of all time. I'm fairly sure he actually ran the 200-meter sprint in a faster time than Usain Bolt's record. So how is it that Andre, who's only 5'8", was able to outperform Usain Bolt? Well, he must have been able to compensate in other ways. For example, he may have refined his sprinting technique so much that it actually compensated for him not being naturally tall. So if we compare this to how, say, you might prepare for an upcoming biology test, do you just smash out as many practice questions or practice tests as humanly possible? Because assuming you're not a natural genius, this sounds very similar to Andre running the 100 or 200 meter sprint every single day, expecting to outperform some of these athletes with greater genetic ability. Practice questions are okay, but you can't really expect drastic improvements if you're not addressing the underlying cause of your underperformance. Because the majority of the population are not natural geniuses, if we want to approach becoming a high-performing student, we need to approach it similarly to how a genetically average person would approach becoming a professional athlete. You need to be considering every single variable. This might be what study techniques you use, what practice questions you use, how you approach questions, your mindset, minimizing distractions, reflecting on your study, all that sort of stuff. If you can fine-tune every single one of these variables, I promise you can level up your approach to study and minimize the number of hours you spend. So one of our goals here at AIM Academics is to actually help students reduce their reliance on practice questions by actually helping them address the underlying cause of their underperformance. Whether this be particular question types or study habits or even their mentality of approaching study that might not be serving them as well as, say, other techniques could be. If you think about it, it's actually technically possible to eliminate the need for practice questions entirely, because if you understood it well enough the first time, in other words, you learnt it so efficiently, you wouldn't actually need to practice it. This isn't something that I would personally recommend. I don't recommend completely eliminating practice questions in your study regime, because I do think it's very important for students to develop their ability to describe conceptually challenging concepts, especially from a variety of different angles, but it is something conceptually interesting nevertheless, that if we did develop our ability to learn enough, we wouldn't really need practice questions. So I hope so far what we've gathered is that chasing desirable difficulties is very important for promoting efficient study, and that practice questions are not the be-all and end-all. So I've sort of danced around this idea of desirable difficulties, and that's for an important reason, because there's so many ways to chase desirable difficulties in your study. But there's also so much more to consider. You can't just go climbing mountains or sprinting 100-meter sprints if you haven't addressed the foundations first. Surprisingly, one way to actually make your study sessions more efficient is to set yourself up to study properly with pre-study. It might sound stupid, but you want to set your intention in terms of what you want to get out of each study session. You want to set yourself specific goals or SMART goals such that when you start studying, you know what you're working towards. Once you outline clear, specific SMART goals, your brain no longer needs to spend extra energy sort of working out what you're doing, and it's more easily for you to maintain focus and actually get done what you've set out to do. It's very hard to study if you don't know what you want to achieve in that specific study session. Another thing that's actually very useful is ritualization. Your brain really likes patterns. So if you set up some sort of study ritual that you continually stick to, you sort of trick your brain into maintaining focus or getting into focus much more quickly. For example, this might be something as simple as, making yourself a cup of tea before every time you study, or studying in the same room with the same sort of music. Another important idea that I really want to point out is that so many students get tricked into thinking that more study or more work is the way to go. When in fact, we should be thinking that more efficient, less time spent studying would be much better, right? But sadly, this isn't the case. So many people get proud of, how many notes they've written or how many hours they've spent studying. But that's actually not as impressive as saying, oh, I only studied for 1 hour, but it was so efficient that I then sat that test and got 100%. So once again, the way that we can achieve this, if you haven't realized already, is seeking better, smarter ways to study. So what's shown to you is a depiction of what's known as solo taxonomy. This is actually what is taught to your teachers when they're studying their degree in education. Teachers are actually taught to ask questions in tests and exams based on this framework. So if you can understand this framework, it's almost like a hack where you sort of know what your teacher was thinking and what sort of questions they might ask you in tests. So when you're preparing for an upcoming test or an exam, you want to actually be thinking about the various ways that your teacher or the exam writer could be testing you based on solo taxonomy. Basically, tests and exams can test various different levels of understanding of a concept or idea. An individual with a pre-structural understanding is an individual with no competence at that given idea or concept. They inappropriately approach the concept and actually need some external prompts in order to get started. This would be like if you had no idea what the mitochondrion was in biology, and you had no idea where it's found or what its purpose was. Similarly, a unistructural understanding would be like if you knew what a mitochondrion was, but you didn't know what it looked like, what it does, or how it relates to anything else in biology or anything. The pre-structural and unistructural levels of understanding are not what your teachers are testing in year 12. You aren't just regurgitating facts in isolation with no context or relation to other ideas. The unistructural level of understanding might be assessed in, say, year 7, where you might present a fact in exchange for a mark. What's more interesting though are these higher order levels of understanding, which is where year 12 SACE exam and test questions are testing. However, even a multi-structural level of understanding won't get you very far in year 12. This is the idea of looking at a variety of facts, but only in isolation, and you have no idea how these facts relate to each other. Unfortunately, for many ideas or concepts, students are only able to achieve a multi-structural level of understanding. This means that the students have gaps in knowing how the concepts actually relate to each other. And this is what majority of year 12 questions are testing. They're testing whether you fully understand how concepts relate to each other, opposed to just testing your understanding of concepts in isolation. For example, it's not just enough to know the structure and function of every organelle. You should know how the organelles relate to each other, how they depend on each other to achieve a mutual outcome, or what would happen to one organelle if another one was damaged. What I'm alluding to here is that mostly relational and extended abstract understanding is necessary for doing well in year 12. You need to fully and deeply understand how ideas connect to each other and not just view them in isolation. Every single curveball question in previous SACE exams are testing your understanding of relationships between concepts. They require relational and extended abstract understanding. These common curveball questions will require you to draw relationships or describe relationships between familiar concepts, or even form new relationships and apply your knowledge to unfamiliar circumstances. So ultimately, your approach to study needs to be heavily tailored to forming these relationships between ideas and rationalizing where each piece of information fits in with relation to other ideas. Creating strong connections between ideas not only allows you to tackle curveball questions that are testing your understanding of relationships between ideas, it also reduces the amount that you need to memorize because you've sort of chunked it together with pre-existing knowledge rather than viewing it as its own unique separate piece of information as you might if you had a multi-structural level of understanding. So in year 12, you really can't get away with just knowing facts or even understanding them. You really need to be tapping in to those higher order levels of competence and understanding such that you're equipped for even the trickiest curveball questions. So one way to make the process of forming connections and learning more efficient when you're studying is to first scope out the topic or the content you're about to study and develop sort of like a backbone or an organizational structure in your brain. And you can do this by looking at the content you're about to cover and asking yourself, why is this important? And how do these concepts relate to other concepts or to each other? What you're effectively doing here is you're priming your brain to recognize certain information as being important, such that when you actually go to chase those desirable difficulties when you're studying, you're more inclined to actually remember those critical pieces of information and know how they relate to each other. You really want to be organizing the information in your brain as much as you can, so you then know sort of where to go in your brain to retrieve that information. It's like if you were to dump all of your belongings in your bedroom and then every day make the active effort to find them, rather than having a clear, organized layout in your bedroom where you knew exactly where things relate to each other and where to find things. So when you're scoping out a topic or whatever you're about to study, you don't just want to be asking what things are. You can imagine that if your pure intention for studying was just to understand what everything is, you're more likely to get bored and you don't really have a deep, clear intention for your study session. So let's go through an example of this to illustrate how important this is. So let's consider the following pieces of information. Humans possess enucleated red blood cells, meaning they lack a nucleus. They also lack any organelles. Aerobic respiration requires the mitochondrion, and fermentation occurs in the cytoplasm. Perhaps even have a go at trying to learn these facts using the approach that you would usually use to prepare for a test or an exam. Whether this be writing linear notes, reading out loud, summarizing, rereading, actively recalling, whatever it might be. Whichever approach you would usually take to learn bits of information, I want you to take that approach to learn these facts right now. Now let's have a go at applying that information to a question that's specifically testing our higher order level of understanding. In particular, it's testing our relational understanding, which you might say this is a curveball question. So pyruvate kinase, shown on the left, is the enzyme involved in the last step of glycolysis. It catalyzes the transfer of a phosphate group from phosphoenol pyruvate to adenosine diphosphate, yielding one molecule of pyruvate and one molecule of ATP. Genetic defects of this enzyme cause the disease known as pyruvate kinase deficiency. In this condition, a lack of pyruvate kinase slows down the process of glycolysis. Explain why pyruvate kinase deficiency is especially devastating for red blood cells. How confident do you feel about answering this question? Do you feel like you could be more confident? Or more importantly, are you confident that the study techniques that you use to explore these concepts specifically allowed you to explore the connections between ideas that are being tested in this specific question? Also, can you see what connection or what relationship between concepts is being tested in this question? Did you already know this relationship, or did you establish this relationship as I asked you the question? If you did already know this connection or this relationship, how did you know this relationship? Was this just by chance, or was it your study techniques that allowed you to explore such a wide variety of relationships that you happen to encounter this relationship already in your study? What I'm trying to say here is that we want our study techniques to intentionally enable us to develop connections between ideas and concepts. That way then when a curveball question comes around, which is specifically testing a relationship between certain ideas, our study techniques have already allowed us to explore those relationships, so we're much better equipped to tackle those questions. Ultimately, in a test or an exam, it's much better to rely on connections that we've pre-established through our study rather than just relying on, say, fluid intelligence. So what are some of the most common study techniques that we see students use year after year? Most students would either write linear notes, or reread their notes, highlight their notes, or perhaps view some PowerPoint slides and copy down those notes or put them away and then try and recall them. Some students might utilize some more advanced concepts like active recall strategies or spaced repetition, flashcards. But in fact, none of these strategies are very good at enabling you to specifically explore connections between ideas. Most of these strategies limit you to only a multi-structural level of understanding, not that relational abstract understanding that we need for year 12. Practice questions and practice tests are by far the most commonly used study technique that we see students use. Don't get me wrong, practice questions are okay, but the problem with practice questions is they only allow you to explore a discrete variety of relationships or connections that specific set of practice questions enables you to explore. So what you're effectively doing when you use practice questions is you hope that the specific connections that are going to be tested in your test or exam is going to match the same connections that are being tested in the specific set of practice questions or practice papers that you use. But what are the chances that the specific connections being tested in your exam or test are going to match the specific connections that are tested in your set of practice questions that you choose to use? So your approach to study needs to enable you to explore a whole variety of relationships, not just those that are pre-established by your discrete set of practice questions. So finally, what are some study techniques that can enable you to explore relationships between ideas to achieve that level of relational learning that's required to tackle the hardest curveball questions that you might see in this year's SACE exams? But please, keep in mind I have not ranked these study techniques by any metric of importance or efficiency. I've literally just written down what came to mind. This list is also very incomplete, and I could think of so many more that you could be using in your study regime. So really what I wanted to get out of this video is I want you to become aware of some of the study techniques that might not be serving you as well as you thought. I also want you to finish this video with a bit of a clearer intent in terms of what you actually want to get out of your study sessions in terms of developing those clear relationships between ideas, which is something that you might not have thought about before as being a very high priority. Our ultimate aim is to transition away from a multi-structural level of understanding where we view concepts in isolation, but rather transition into that relational understanding where we're really critically evaluating every single possible connection between all of the ideas and concepts that we're taught. So if you've made it this far in this video, congratulations, that's great. You're already above your peers who haven't seen this video. But what's actually more important is what you do with this knowledge. You now have the power of awareness, where you can choose if you're just going to keep taking the same approach, or perhaps you're going to become more open-minded and explore ways that you can save your time and actually get the grades you want. It's ultimately your choice, but just know that there's no better time than now to start exploring some changes. Now, with the time constraints of this mini course, I'm only limited to provide you with a certain amount of information. It wouldn't exactly be a mini course if I spoke about study techniques for 8 hours. So now I just quickly want to mention that we are running July exam preparation masterclasses. These masterclasses give you the perfect opportunity to come work with our team to pinpoint where in your study habits or techniques are actually letting you down and what study techniques could be serving you better. Now, of course, there's no obligation to attend these sessions. It's completely and entirely up to you. If you're satisfied enough with this mini course, then that's great. But obviously, these masterclasses, we actually run over 5 days, so a total of 10 hours per course, where we can provide you with basically all the information we know about doing well in Year 12 exams, such that you can now take the time from now all the way up until the end of your exams to start revising and refining your approach, such that by the time exams come around, you know exactly what to do. If in this video you found it beneficial and you've learned something, then there's actually a whole lot more that you could learn if you come work with us in person. But I'll also be giving some live demonstrations of efficient study techniques and how you can implement them for the end of your exams to get the grades you want. So for the rest of this mini course, my team and I will be aiming to give you as much value as possible, but keep in mind that it's quite hard to teach you everything we know in such a limited amount of time. Nevertheless, I hope you find this mini course beneficial, and I'll catch you on the other side.